Yep.
Well, I'll do the usual virtual clap and get us started. My name is Morten Elvang. Welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup group. And today, this morning, this afternoon, it's a real pleasure to have John Cutler joining us. And I think, like all of us, I've come to know you, John, from the person on the internet who always seemed to make sense. So as we got this series going, which I briefly introduced you to before we opened up for everyone, is that we have had like a number of people sharing their view on strategy. And it seems to be the perfect opportunity to also invite you to share what you think about the topic of strategy. And we have been asking everybody two questions. One is, how do you actually see the topic of strategy? Is there something special going on at the moment? And the second one is that if you are an employee in a larger company and you agree that strategy is becoming more important, how could you get yourself involved in that topic? I mean, what should you do or not do to get more influence on whatever is the prevailing strategy where you're working?
Yep.
Does that
Nice.
make
Let's
sense?
start with those. Yeah,
Very well.
absolutely. And let's start with those and we can pivot to if other folks have any questions. I'll give folks a little bit of background. It's always important to share context because we might not share context. And so that would be helpful. Yeah, my name is John. I have a background in product management and UX research. I have primarily worked in scaling tech, pure digital product selling companies. That's an important detail. So these are companies that sell a digital product. People buy the digital product or they subscribe to the digital product and they use it. Worked at companies like Zendesk, analytics companies like Amplitude, Toast, which is vertical, be it business to business software. And in the range directly at those companies were sort of sub 2,000 person companies working to that. I also had some background in banking. I worked in investment bank, not as an investment banker, but as I started in college. I had a night job working in a PowerPoint factory. And all we would do every night is meet from 10 p.m. until 9 a.m. the next morning and create, this was 1999, 2000, 2001, or 1998. We would create 100-page decks about the latest tech companies that they would be using. And so I did that. I was a musician at the time and a college student, and this is what I did at night. But that was sort of an early entry into even you're reading strategy documents every single night for 10 hours. Sometimes there's not a lot of strategy in those documents, but they were still fun. They were often written with 5-point text as well. So you had to be very careful about what you read, not to go to these things. So yeah, my background's in UX research, product management in these growth digital product selling companies predominantly. An interesting detail though, when I worked at this company called Amplitude, is a product analytics company, my role was something called a product evangelist. And what that meant was I sort of was a coach and workshop facilitator for our customers. And that's an important detail here because our customers ranged from, Ford to our Norwegian government offices, to plumbing supply companies in Australia, to mega banks, to Bloomberg, Kmart, massive companies, small companies, tiny startups with 5 people in it. And during that time, while I was there, I forget where it clocked out at, but I think it was over I stayed there for 4 years. It was close to 1,000 like one-on-one leader coaching sessions from diverse companies and hundreds of workshops. If anyone on the call is a consultant, I had it easy because I didn't need to sell these things. It was free for customers. So of course you get, Ford calls you one day and says they want to do a product strategy workshop or an analytics workshop or doing those things. So I wouldn't say that I worked at these companies on a deep level, but I spent hours with them or a day with them. And that gave a very interesting cross-section view of companies. So that's a little bit about myself. Sort of the full-time jobs were in these rapid scale-up startups, but then I've had exposure across these different companies, which is an interesting thing to do. Cool. with that in mind, I see some familiar names too. This is great. I'm excited to do this. All right, this is good. Um, so I wanted to share a couple thoughts on your questions, and then we could jump into more things. I have a couple theories as to why, but I have definitely observed an increased interest in strategy, in product strategy, in company strategy, etc., in chatting with people. Um, and working with these companies. And I have a couple of theories about why. Well, first, there's lots of information out there. It's very accessible, beyond books or beyond necessarily doing case studies in a business school. There's a lot of great content out there. In fact, the other day, I met with a young person from India. He's 23 years old, and he gave a near perfect lecture on the call to his coworkers for about an hour and a half about the topic of strategy. um, 23, and at a level that it's very rare to find people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s and beyond, at my age at 50, delivering that level of conceptual knowledge, at least of the different schools of strategy, how strategy works, the strategies of different companies, et cetera. I think this is kind of amazing if you think about it, because this sort of black art that's always seemed to exist, where there was people who understood strategy, or maybe went to business school, or maybe did these particular things. Um, a lot of that information has been democratized, and so anyone who fashions themselves as a nerd of these types of things is at least conceptually very educated, or they have the knowledge. Knowledge and skill are different, right? But at least they have the knowledge at that point. The applied knowledge or skill, that's a little bit of a different game to be able to do those things. So I think back to that investment bank days. These are people who had spent time in business school for N number of years and then done one job in consulting, then come back to the bank, and they had to put 1,000 decks together for different clients and things. And so they had the strategy language down, but now someone with just some eagerness and an internet connection obviously can access this information. So I think that that's one thing that's amazing. The second thing, and this might be more controversial, is that I think people are genuinely frustrated with their companies. Um, and they have more visibility into what's going on with their companies. And I call this the justing problem, which is you observe that a lot of people see that their company are sort of flailing, and they come to the conclusion, well, if we just had a strategy, if we just could adopt Kanban, if we could just visualize the work, if we just understood flow theory, if we could just have a strategy, things would work. And so I think that there's a general apathy is not necessarily the word. It's sort of trepidation or a little bit of criticism that people on the front lines now, because you can be 23 and pick up this information and have general awareness as what's going on, and you can listen to the investor calls of your company. You can do whatever you want. People are identifying a perceived gap in their companies, and they have decided that the root cause of all their too much work in progress and all their inability to prioritize and all of their ability to be able to do these things is strategy. That's it. Strategy is the cause of these things. And again, this might sound controversial. I think some people are bored at work. Their work is not stimulating. They're being told to build X or build Y or ship X or ship Y or build this project or build that project. No one's really explaining to them why they're doing it. And then you stumble online to read about Simon Wardley or Stratechery or any of these particular resources about strategy. And you start scratching your head and you're like, I don't really understand the impact of what I'm doing. My business doesn't seem to be very good at this. At least I'm not in the room where it happens. So I'm going to become a strategy nerd in this, right? I've understood what the problem is for the particular company. So there's a bit of that going on based on my observation to do these. And then I think the third shift is that as there is more pressure to push decision-making authority down to the front lines, there is increased need to share decision-making heuristics and strategic heuristics and principles and concepts with folks on the front line. So to give you an example, I did an activity with, a 3,000 person organization. We surveyed the front lines and basically said, on a weekly basis, are you needing to make some kind of trade-off decision where more strategic context would be helpful? They replied. 3,000 people replied. We got this huge survey back. And the degree of intelligence in those questions was sort of off the charts. I mean, people were saying things like, if I understood the timing of our international expansion better, I might be able to more effectively be able to make this prioritization or trade-off decision today. Or if I understood our level of confidence related to our new enterprise segment expansion strategy, I would be able to do this. What this indicates to me is that the level of decision making that's being pushed to the front lines is higher and getting higher and higher. So as opposed to a situation where a small group of people decide what projects to build, and then 3 years later, people actually start working on it, and then 3 years later, they actually ship. And by that point, the company's in private equity and no one cares about what they decided about. That's a long cycle time, right? The pressure is now heating up for people to be able to make frontline decisions to be able to do that. And I actually have a model that I use a fair amount that I developed called mandate levels. And this is an interesting frame to be able to understand the decision-making authority trends. Let me just go to it at the moment. Hold on. I'm just having to open up my browser, so it's just going to take me a second. So in this mandate levels model, you have sort of, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 levels of mandate. And the reason why I developed this model is because it's easy to sort of throw your hands up in the air and talk about empowerment. But what is empowerment? Because if you talk to 1,000 organizations, one company's empowerment is the next company's like gulag, right? Like it's very, very difficult to be able to do this. So in this model, we break out these levels of mandate levels. And so what is interesting about this is this shift, essentially, where in many companies, the mandate levels are highly segmented hierarchically, and you've got a general manager who owns some business outcome and then ostensibly a strategy around that outcome. There is some kind of commercial product manager. This happens in larger companies. And then there's this odd IT, the business divide, and they're throwing things over the fence to a product owner who maybe is given a more open-ended problem. That's about the extent of that particular mandate. And down here at the bottom, you have a developer building something to exactly this to a predetermined specification. Now, if you work in a model like this, there's no need to communicate strategy. Why? The executive team can go off for 5 days. They do a retreat. They decide what's important. They set their business goals. They do what they want to do. They build their things. There's no need to have a strategy in this case. However, as the rightmost example becomes more prevalent, as the IT business divide falls away, as the technology becomes the business, you see the pushing of the mandates to be much higher, right? You see the trend of developers and designers going all the way to some discovery level functions in the company, explore various potential leverage points and run experiments to influence these things. This is fundamentally a strategic question. It's a strategic, interesting question that you have to do that. And so that's what I would say is the third trend is just, I have more examples of this in many different models. But that's the next thing. This is the third component that I'm observing out there necessarily in the world. And so I think, yeah, so to summarize there's changing mandate levels. I think there's a sort of level of kind of consternation and distrust maybe blurring, like as those mandate levels change, people on the front lines are more questioning the strategies of their company. Look, why is it like this? And there is some degree of boredom a little bit. People are not necessarily engaged, and so they're very, very deep into the strategy side of what they're doing. And then the first theme there would be the accessibility of information about strategy is definitely very attractive, and it's attracting a lot of people earlier in their career to these particular questions. I don't know if Morten, that sort of helps with that first question, but those are sort of three trends that I'm observing at that point.
I think it's wonderful. So the thought I actually had when you showed your mandate level is that, and it may not be what you had in mind, but it's a bit like assumptions are made in the top, but they are busted in the bottom. So in that
Yeah,
sense, the balance is a bit shifting because the assumptions are being sort of rebutted more and more often compared to what you probably have been used to. So it's almost like a
exactly.
shift of balance, which I think you illustrated brilliantly.
Yeah,
And
and the shift of and the survey was very. I can't show you the results of this because it was within a certain company, but um, the key takeaway there is that the level of strategic thinking encapsulated in the questions from frontline designers and developers
yeah,
was at an extremely high level,
yes,
suggesting at least that they were making these decisions or could sense the fact that lack of clarity in those areas was causing some level of difficulty to make decisions on the front lines. And so I can't show you one, but just trust me that it's, if you read a 3 paragraph question from someone who's 26, who's never been a manager in their life, and they're talking about like global supply chain and why has the digital strategy failed to account for X? you begin to realize you're like, okay, something's different here. This is a 26-year-old frontline designer developer with extremely evolved sense of strategy, and they're asking these questions. So that's a very interesting data point to me.
then I could imagine another thing I would love to hear your observation on this is that we talk about organizations getting more and more networked, but that
Yeah,
also means that you have more and more connected contexts because there's polarization in such networks. So from
yeah,
having one overarching strategy that you described first with general managers feeding this to product managers, feeding it forward to people who eventually do it, is almost like one context for everything. Now,
yeah.
actually, we'll have a much more diverse set of contexts, each with their take on what strategy is, potentially even beyond the context where you try to fit it in. Is that something you
Yeah,
have reflected on?
absolutely. And I think that what I call it is these sort of this frame problem. It's I'll show you one thing that folks will laugh about. Sorry if I'm flipping to things, but I think that this is particularly funny. So in this, yeah, there a lot of companies are sitting there saying, if we could just decide on what strategic framework we're using, everything would be okay. It doesn't work like that. And so I have a funny slide that represents kind of the current condition. I did this whole deck on how to navigate currents of change and all sorts of things, but I have this one slide which represents the current situation in most of these companies is that you've got the design, you've got the finance person with their spreadsheet. You've got the customer experience person with their high level strategic journey map. You've got the team topologies is going to save the day person. You've got the impact mapping jobs to be done person over here. You've got the cascading tree over there. And everyone is arguing about which framework should we use. And the reality is they're all good. All of them, all of them. Like you need to have like coupling between these particular frameworks. Oh, sorry. In the upper left, you have the domain-driven design. If we could just do domain-driven design, that would be great. If we could just adopt jobs to be done, it would be great. If we could just adopt team topologies, it would be great. If we could just do growth loops and product-led, it would be great. If we could just do service blueprinting, it would be great. If we could just do finance-driven development, it'd be great. Yes, all of them. So the number of meetings that you're in where it's this kind of model trap is an extremely interesting question. Exactly to your point. The other funny, well, I find these things funny, at least if you're into this kind of stuff. Um, the other thing that's interesting is I would say that there's also a lot of people in the change agent category, or maybe the folks that are on this call, that are also coming to some realization that they had been holding on to the one way this whole time and are realizing that there's more ways out there. And I have a funny, I'll give these presentations very, very short, but this is a joke. It's the person thinking that they were going to get a seat at the table, but realizing that their seat in the table was inside the aquarium, which is inside the aquarium, which is inside the pond. You're never finally reaching the seat at the table. But it's this effort of this idea of, if we could just align people on the terms of strategy, everything would be okay. Well, when you're in organizations, I've gone through this in my own career. I went through the words thing. You know what? Defining quality, suddenly people stop thinking about what quality is, or defining strategy, suddenly everyone has 10 definitions. Well, okay, so defining strategy is not going to help. We're going to find the perfect abstraction. We're going to find the perfect level of abstraction for strategy. Guess what? I've done it. Executives can handle at most 3 by 3. So that's a 9 box. So your maximum level of cognitive load for a senior executive is 9. 3 times 3. You'll probably do better with a 2 by 2, or you'll probably do better with 3 bullets. Okay, but you can't just decide on one. Like, you have to work on all levels. I've done these things of trying to find the perfect level of abstraction for these, in strategy. Well, it never works. You have many different customers for these levels of abstraction. And then my boss will say, I think it has to be simple. Okay, so you're never going to escape for these things. The same thing with these strategic pyramids. It's like the search for the perfect enterprise architecture model where everything has a name and everyone understands it is a losing game. You will never find the perfect level of abstraction because you're dealing with different lenses. And this happens with strategy all the time. Like, we've decided on our V2 mom strategy cascade. Well, it's one model and it's wrong, right? It's wrong. All these trees, all these loops, like all these things eventually break. Anyway, it's all to say you inspired me around that particular area, is that a trend, what I'm seeing is that people are appreciating, slowly maybe, that there are many different frames of strategy and that there's not necessarily just one right frame. And you see this a lot with the Wardley mapping folks. They've created these capability graphs. They're very interesting. You put it against some stage of evolution and proximity to customers, and you try to understand the movements of the nodes across the graph. There's some level of strategic understanding there. That's great. And then they learn this and they think, aha, that's it. Wardley mapping. It's the answer to all my problems. And then, like, 3 weeks later, like, oh my God, I'm in a company. It's a very, like, political, cultural environment. There's all sorts of different views on what's going on. I'll put that in my tool chest and to be able to do it. The final thing I would say around that is, back to the lens problem. I did write a post called Level, Depth, Time, and Frame, which is helpful for people to think about it. I think there are some patterns with the sort of strategic conversation that do appear over and over, which is, there is some concept that there are these levels between customers and corporate that actually represent some kinds of levels of strategy. There is a general idea that you have some kind of depth or specificity range. So you have strategies that are more conceptual and abstract, and things that are more precise and task-oriented. Time will always be a factor. There is a nesting of time as you go through these. But important, Morten, long way of answering your question, are the frames. There's a commercially focused frame, a dynamic capabilities frame, a principles and culture frame, a product capabilities frame, an investment horizons frame, a risk and governance frame, an organizational design frame, technology capabilities frame, competitive frame, ecosystem frame. All these represent sort of you can apply strategic thinking within these frames, but the idea that there is like one frame to rule them all, or that the people in your company will be good at all these frames simultaneously is the likelihood there is very, very low. So
Yeah.
that's some things I've discovered about this.
John, I'm gonna break my own rules and ask you a question because
Yeah.
I found the word actionable to actually explain a lot of this, meaning that as a person you have a natural context that you operate in.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
you kind of know it, but of course it's fuzzy. And then if you think of the concept of strategy as guiding your choice,
Yeah.
then the relevancy is that the guidance needs to be actionable. It needs to be
Yeah.
something you can relevantly do in your context, which actually
Absolutely.
nests on all the things you mentioned with context and time, etc. Would you agree to that observation, or potentially
I
even
love, well, there's a choice domain. You're
exactly?
making choices within a certain domain.
Yeah,
And if you think about, and this is I have some 2 or 3 slides to share on that because I think that it's very important concept what you just said. You said it so much better or beautifully than I could really to do it. But um, sorry if there's little drawings on my presentations. It probably means that I was talking through someone as we were going through. But there's this idea. It only occurred to me about 3 weeks ago. I work at a company that used to have a marketing campaign, connect the dots, and I was sitting there scratching my head, and I was saying, I don't know if connecting the dots is what we need to do. Or they had a line which said, connecting strategy to execution. So to your point, humans are very good translators across domain contexts. We're very, very good at this. And yet in a lot of these companies, it's just like spreadsheet mode. People are not communicating. They're sort of filling out forms, which to your point is not really about your choice domain. It's about moving information up and down the organization. Anyway, I have some examples of why that doesn't work. But this is really what the slide that you reminded me of, which is in any company, there are some elements of strategy which form the middleware of the company. It's the shared language, the global norms, maybe some accepted ideas of the particular company.
yeah,
However, all action, all behavior is local.
yes,
It's
yeah,
never global. It's never, never global. And so the local context within which this team is making this particular decision or their choice context, like obviously, look, the leaders are giving money out.
yeah,
Okay, so that shifts this global environment a fair amount. But people are only making these contexts. But this was the slide, right? Which is no one wants to see all the dots. Realistically, like people just want to see the dots related to the decision that they need to make. Now, sometimes they might need to pass a line through the mess to give them their bullets. Maybe they feel better about their thing, but no one can handle the cognitive load of every dot in your company. And if you simplify your company strategy to be universally applicable, almost by definition, it means it lacks teeth.
oh,
Like
exactly,
any strategy suitably
yeah,
communicated across a company will be too simple.
yes,
So
yeah.
anyway, that's matching what you're saying.
Oh, it's beautiful. I found a term that seems to resonate with people for what you drew, which I call the black market for common sense. That means that in the absence of guidance, you fill in the blanks with what makes sense from a local context,
Yeah.
which is a lot. Enough breaking the rules. I wanted to hold you to one question, and I think you partly answered it already. But if you are in the middle of all of this, and you
Yeah.
realize the increasing importance of strategy as something you got to take serious as an employee, what can you do to get into this and take a stronger stance in influencing what guidance is giving in your context?
I actually think to go back to that survey thing or whatever, there's some really important lesson there, which is understand your choice landscape.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
basically, this is my point is that the people just sort of shouting in their companies, I didn't see the leadership team produce a Wardley map, or I didn't see the leadership team write a 45-page deep treatise on strategy. Therefore, we don't, it's all broken. No, no, no. That's unreasonable on some sense. But to sort of say, like, look, in my area, in our choice domain, we have important choices. We have one-way door decisions. We have two-way door decisions. We have areas with optionality. We have areas without optionality. Um, Here is where strategic context would help. I'll give you a very specific example. I met with someone yesterday. She's great. I worked with Sam a lot over the years. She was very frustrated that her company didn't have what's known as a marketecture, which is essentially like a naming of your product lines,
Yeah, yeah,
identifying which product lines relate to particular customers, maybe mapping to capabilities in your product. You can imagine this is called marketecture in that space. I wouldn't call it strategy, but it's definitely an artifact that could help trigger discussions around strategy. And I kept asking her, well, why do you need it? Why do you need it? And what it turned out is that the company was whale hunting massive enterprise companies. And whenever they landed one of those companies, the whole development team would have to spend the next year trying to cater to that customer.
yeah,
And it was creating a very fragile revenue base for the company.
mm, yeah,
And they literally they couldn't scale that. They
mm,
didn't have a particularly good platform strategy to be able to accommodate these large customers. So there's a lot of custom development. They spent the whole year doing it. And meanwhile, so you do all that to make one $20 million customer instead of 40, $500,000 customers. And what she was really saying is, I believe there an opportunity exists for us to create a low touch, low effort motion to diversify our revenue base and add defensible beachheads to our company instead of going all in on Walmart or whoever they're going on, Kmart or something. Now, what was interesting back to that is that was the start of a
mm,
strategy discussion. So instead of going to the leaders of her company and saying, we just need a marketecture, it's like saying
yeah,
we
yeah,
just need a
yes,
strategy.
yeah,
She was able to say, I'm curious. We looked at the data while she was on the call. Like, I'm curious. I've looked at the data. We had 600 leads for our low touch motion over the last year, and we converted very low percentage of them. I'm wondering whether there's opportunities to diversify these things. And then suddenly these executives who had sort of ignored her for a long time at least started paying attention to what she was saying. So I think that that's the choice, the
yeah,
choice landscape,
yeah,
and understanding the
yeah,
what decisions that are currently being juggled and maybe some asymmetries in that decision making is the best place to start, I think, for this
yeah.
to do it.
Okay, that's actually wonderful advice. It resonates with a piece of research I read, which is exactly your point, meaning that as an employee, when you pass information upwards, it's there's too little context in it. So you need to actually broaden the context in a way that it resonates more with the target group.
Yeah,
I think wonderful example. Thank
yeah,
you. Would it be
yeah.
okay to
My
open it
pleasure.
up a bit for people on the line?
Oh yeah, and there's super smart. Yeah, I want to learn from folks too. Yeah, any questions that you think I could help with, or you just want to talk about is fun too.
Okay,
Um,
so let's open it up for questions or comments to John. So let also be quite a number of people on the line. So please use the protocol to raise your hand, at least if you go second. The first can go without. Please, any questions or comments for John?
You got a question from Tom in the chat.
okay, let me go. Oh, is there something I'm subscribed to?
I have it here. So
Question. Oh, question. What about successful organizational results improvement as a result of strategy? What about successful? Tom, could you just speak to that question? I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but happy to. I think I get it.
Okay, yeah, you probably do. Um, uh, I, I think strategy is supposed to drive better organizational results. You agree?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everybody agrees. So, and I didn't hear you talking much about it, but I'm sure you can
Yeah.
address it. And the last part of the question is, can you identify any strategic planning methods that seem to work best in actually giving people results?
Yeah. So I love this. So I think a great start for this is when I worked at this company that was very data, we sold analytics software. Um, I evolved this, I basically called it the kind of data informed product loop. Nothing fancy on here, but it is actually very relevant to the question about strategy. Um, And so it sort of described a lot of, we've all seen build, measure, learn, or observe, orient, decide, act, or plan, do, check, act. We've all seen these types of things. But often what it misses a little bit is uh, an explicit understanding that there is some level of strategy. There's some sort of tapestry of ideas that equate to strategy. And yet to deploy that strategy, this is where I think people confuse strategy and strategy deployment. They see the five, I was joking with Morton, they see the five Parthenon pillar slide for their company, and they say, goodness, I read Richard Rummelt. That's not a strategy. That's a bad strategy. And it's like, no, that's not the strategy. The executive team spent 5 days locked up in a room. That is their attempt at strategy deployment. They are trying to make it simple for you to understand it. Not well. I think that they could do a better job, which is what sort of Tom is getting at a little bit. And so anyway, so the strategy deployment side is there's some level of modeling. So, maybe in this bank, we want to be their primary bank. You've taken the strategy and sort of broken it into some more actionable levers, right? How do we become their primary bank? You need to fund it efficiently. You need to help bankers act and understand on insights. Financial life integration. We want to deepen our relationship with the customers. Trust, reliability. We need to be at least as trustworthy as the next bank. This is a neobank, so they have to compete and disrupt other companies. And then there is this level then of attaching measures and metrics to these particular things. And then there is identifying leverage points, which in itself is sort of a strategic activity. Like, where do we have the most leverage to be able to move these things that we think we need to be able to move? You need to be able to design experiments and bets and intervene. You need to be able to do something to impact change. And then you need to measure impact and you need to integrate learning. The reason why I share this is because there are plenty of companies. I use this sort of think big 2x2, which has think big, think small, work big, work small. And so a lot of companies, they think big and work big and they never get anything done and there's no results, right? So they have the strategy, they're thinking big, they understand what they're doing, but they haven't figured out how to work small. They haven't figured out how to actually move around this loop. Also, especially in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of companies that are very data driven, but they're driving in data circles. They're actually thinking small and working small. It's fine, but they're not deepening these sort of understanding of the strategy side. There's also companies that go around this loop fairly effectively until they integrate learning, right? So they actually are doing this fairly well, but they're never revitalizing their strategy to be able to do it. A similar view of this could be this particular diagram, which is, and this will get to Tom's question. Sorry, I like drawings and things like that, so you have to live with it a little bit on this call. Look, strategy is one part of the picture. And so you see plenty of companies these days, they've read about strategy and they say, okay, well, we've got our strategy. Okay, so let's get our unicorn emoji here. So they have their unicorn strategy. Great. Hooray, they brought in Morton. They have a wonderful strategy. I'm just kidding. I don't know if you do this, but like if you were to do it, this would be funny. Okay. And yet, at the same time, the organizational structure is in no way aligned around that strategy. The architecture is in no way aligned around that strategy. This causes tons of dependencies and constraints, so no one can get anything done. There's no agency. There's very low confidence. People can't focus. There's no optionality. Decision quality is low. They have 1,000 things in progress at once, so flow is broken. And maybe they have no way to understand if anything they're doing is working. Maybe situational awareness is broken. So therefore, they don't know if anything's working. So the only way they can do is incentivize shipping big projects and never fixing their architecture, right? So it's similar to the loop that I just shared. So it's going to be hard to answer Tom's question just in this short amount of time. I mean, I think that the the bottom line is that you need to see, you need to break down this strategy execution dichotomy and understand strategy as a platform of context that is literally sitting underneath. It is not a cascade down. It is sitting underneath this thing supplying context into the system that you're doing it. And so, obviously to Tom's question, there's some tactics that work well with 1,000-person companies that are highly autonomous that you could never pull off in a big company. If you have 150 fairly independent teams that can ship independently, you could have a lightweight strategy deployment exercise that linked things to actionable inputs and you course corrected based on your collection of that. If you're in a 3,000-person company and you need 1,000 people working together to get anything done, you'll have to adopt a different planning process that's largely around dependency resolution and largely around making sure the executives feel like they're heard, but saying no to them, basically. And so, yeah, the execution of that model is one thing, but I think it's important to see that it's like strategy is a platform undermining and fueling a system. And so if that system is broken in some ways, it's not a strategy problem. But if your strategy doesn't reflect your current capabilities, you've got a problem. So anyway, it's a chicken and egg problem with that. So I didn't answer it great, but those are some thoughts around that. All right.
I was fishing for the name of a method that you favored or had really good experience with.
Uh, See, you're talking to the wrong person. I'm always free. Someone said that the other day, and I'm like, a little bit of Rummel, a little bit of this Wardley mapping stuff, a little bit of blue ocean strategy, kind of sprinkle in a little bit of like options theory, then sprinkle in a little bit of the set like this, what is it, seven powers or seven, I don't really have one particular, and this is what I was going back to about this idea of the many lenses, a very practical thing to know. And I wrote a blog post about this recently, is that all strategy frameworks are essentially variations on a theme. And once you understand that they are all variations on a theme, you then start to be able to ask the question, what I called this post, I'll just sort of show it to you because it's sort of funny, is it said, this is the last strategy framework you'll ever need. It's the last strategy framework you'll ever need. This is what Tom said. All strategic frameworks are: one, a collection of tools to determine what questions you need to answer and when you need to answer them. Two, a collection of tools that help you answer those questions, ranging from simple canvases to complex mapping and sense-making tools. Three, a novel way of organizing and visualizing the answers to those questions. And then four, instructions on how to deploy the strategy and how to understand if the strategy is working or needs refinement. That's every strategy framework of these four things. Questions to ask, tools for answering those questions, tools for organizing and visualizing the answers to those questions, and then tools for deploying the strategy and making sense of what's going on. For example, Jeffrey Moore's zone to win questions. What are the key areas where we must win to ensure long-term growth? Tools for answering the four zones: organize, visualize answers, map initiatives into zones based on their goal and their organization strategy. Four, deploy, assign leaders and resources to each zone, use zone-specific metrics. That's zone to win. Wardley mapping, questions: who is the user, what are their needs, what are their things? Tools for answering Wardley mapping: organize and visualize answers, identify these things on a map, deploy, use the map to test assumptions. On and on and on and on and on. Every Blue Ocean SWAT, Porter Five Forces, Martin, every framework is just a series of those four things: questions, tools for answering, organize, visualize the answers, and deploy the answer. So once you know that, if you're new to this stuff, just learn them all, because they all offer just like slightly different, interesting lenses that could be appropriate within your context to do it.
John, you were alluding at something which I found interesting when you talked about the platform. Because in a way, what you just presented is that strategy is a cure to something, and this is how you diagnose yourself and prescribe yourself treatment, if I read your boxes right. But in your platform analogy, it was actually more that it was a permanent thing that would
Yeah.
interplay with your other actions over time, not as an intervention,
Yeah.
but as a
I should have
continuity.
100%. Let me just jump in there. This post was sort of joking in some ways that it's that simple, right? What you're creating a platform to answer these questions and to make sense of the results and to do those things. So those four things that I mentioned are not, a definitive way to definitively answer your questions. They themselves are a kind of continuous capability that you could apply to those particular things. I was just noting from there that I'll give you an example, just specifically to your question. We were at my company, we do something related to this, but we had a leadership team and they decided that their version of strategy was to list 10 questions. Every month, they go back to the same 10 questions. They ask, has our answer changed? Has our confidence changed? And why? And is there a new question we should vote into the top 10? They publish the answer to the questions to all 1,000 people in their company. And that's the continuous nature that I'm talking about. In essence, they've basically said like, it's, strategy is basically understanding what questions might be relevant, having a reasonable approach to trying to attempt to answer those questions, but then obviously keeping it extremely fluid to what's next. I don't know if that answer made any sense, but.
Well, it does, wouldn't, at least the word that comes to my mind is that it's used for reflection.
Yeah. Yeah.
That you have those 10 questions and you use those to reflect on what has been changing in your context or aspiration.
The change is the important part, which a lot of companies miss. There's a wonderful technique called bullet journaling. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's like a personal productivity technique, but it has a concept called migration. And in bullet journaling, instead of instead of starting with a clean page, you migrate your prior ideas to the current page. And in the process of migrating those ideas, you reflect on them and you refine on it. One of the big mistakes it seems like that companies make is every strategy session is like reinventing the wheel. It's like they've had no prior discussions about any of these particular things. And then they'll say, this year, these two things are important. Oh, so they're the only things that are important. That's all we should work on. No. There's 28 other things that are important from prior years that we talked about. But that's already decided. These are the two things that are important. But the migration concept is a really important concept to thinking about it. The reflection side of it, like reflecting back on those questions and what our current thinking is around them to be able to do it.
There is a local Danish version which I call bubble charting, where bubbles might sort of increase in temperature or reduce in temperature.
Oh, interesting.
It's the same thing.
Cool.
It's like migrating over time.
Yeah.
Very well. So everybody, you have a chance to ask your questions, give your comments. Otherwise, I have plenty. Well, maybe also time to think a little bit about the landing. So please raise your hand if you want to chip in. But John, this has really been wonderful. I mean, you bring in so many broad and diverse perspectives to this. Where are your, and of course you have already shared a lot of this, but where are your own thoughts taking you at the moment? I mean, what's going to happen with this topic of strategy? Is it going to play like a central role, or is it more like it's going to play a bit like a marginal, of course, important the higher you go into the organization, but for the normal employee, a little bit like a marginal mythical role? Is it going to be more central for everyone, or where are things going?
Well, I think that this idea of distributing the problem, and I think that there is, there is kind of an AI element to this, which this is the very curious. There's the big question to me is whether AI is going to facilitate a multi-lens, finally really enable multi-lens approaches. So the common organization is not limited by people's individual cognitive capacity, right? It's limited by you can only fit so many lenses in your head at once. And so the ability to translate lenses or have one piece of information and then translate that into the different lenses is kind of an incredible idea if you think about it. And to give you an example of what I mean, part of this is I do this. Well, yeah, I don't want to talk about the product that I do, but if you go to your average organization and you ask them to list the things that they talk about, you start getting a list like this: customer journeys and touch point. This is what people talk about, not what the systems in their company or their strategy deployment approaches can accommodate, because that hits a kind of level of complexity and reinterpretation that becomes like an exponential problem. And so if you've ever worked in a company that had 3 key personas, 5 regions, all you need is one other dimension before people's heads explode. And I told you, executives can only fit things in 9 boxes. So once you have more than 9 boxes, you effectively can't have a conversation in which you aren't collapsing complexity down for the purpose of finishing the conversation. However, in the day-to-day work, these are all the words that people use, the use cases and the goals and the competitors and the vendors and the integrators and the partnerships and the products and the screens. So you have this extremely rich landscape. And over time as well, material, you come to work, you are writing a test. You also come to work and you are thinking about your winning aspiration, right? So there's this tapestry of things. And I make the joke here, but it actually starts to form this network of ideas in a company. And this is a very, very interesting thing to wrap your head around. And so I think that we potentially might see a situation where we might see a situation where we are better at sharing context within companies. So that there's, the idea of, so when I made the joke about the five pillar Parthenon, the pillars of the Parthenon, that is like the best worst option. And if you criticize your company for doing it, you've never been in a position of having 5,000 people and you have to get up in front of them and talk about your strategy, because 90% of the people in the audience want to see 5-pillar strategy. You don't. You're on this call, so you care about strategy, but most people just want to see the 5 pillars and get back to work and to do their thing, right? So I think there's this very, very interesting potential that exists to start being able to break out of the limits of contextual communication related to company communication, especially around strategy and especially around these particular things. And I think that is extremely interesting. And I'll give you one example, even to what I mean. If you, anyone who has stood in front of a board like this understands how incredible humans are at exception handling and getting on with the job at hand. If you use Jira, the fact that pink ticket is in this part of the workflow, it breaks. Humans are amazing at it. It doesn't matter to the human that the pink ticket is over here and that the purple ticket's over. We get on with the job at hand because we're really good at context. We're really good at exception handling. But at any level of scale across a company, especially in a distributed company, our tools never resemble this. It is only limited to trees and directed graphs and things. And those don't work currently. But if you step back and if you think like, this is a fascinating analysis I did, I take all these words and, this is just an LLM doing clustering based on all the concepts in a company. You have KPIs, metrics, current measures. You have perspectives, insights, feedback, questions. You have triggers, alerts, and notifications. You have queries, filters, metadata, hierarchy. You have structures, configurations, visuals, mapping, schemas, templates, models, frameworks, systems, process. Now, this is the type of thing that before, it's like some enterprise architect had to fit it on one slide and say, oh, we have the system now for our company. But now we have the potential to actually deal with reality. And it's just like pretty amazing if you think about it. I'm not sure if that made sense to people, but there is like the ability to recontextualize and not be limited by hierarchical models of information and moving to more networked models. It provides some kind of like incredible opportunity for sharing context within companies. It's very incredible.
You're striking on something that has come up as a theme, not too explicitly, but I would call it integration across context.
Yeah.
Without unification to a common language, you find ways of understanding perspective across multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
To the point of the lenses as well. So even if you speak different languages, you can still create shared understanding at a certain level.
And that's the incredible, like this idea that if we could just agree on what to call things, if we could just agree what quality is, if we could just agree what value is, never seen it work. In fact, talking about the things take the essence out of the thing. So there's an element of like, I think there's a lot of people in this community, me even 10 years ago, like if we could just visualize all the work, if we could just agree on a common language for things, if we could just agree that it's missions, big rocks, little pebbles, little pieces of sand, and tasks in Jira, the whole world would be figured out. And it's like, no, actually that was false. But the new technologies like provide some potential here to actually address the problem in a different way. I think it's an interesting thing.
This is an association. So I have been operating with a concept I call false standardization.
Yeah.
For example, I believe that there is no standard for requirements that will be universal. But there are probably other things that make sense to standardize in language. So any reflections on that? Meaning, like, where do you?
And this is what I talked about, the middleware of the company.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good word for it, but I think that it is a middleware of the company. It's kind of these ideas that like, the other day, someone was talking to me about process consistency. And I said, consistent interfaces, not consistent processes, right? And I'm not an architect, but I can think about it from my angle. I can think about, these shared principles are a form of beneficial consistency. Whereas telling everyone to have to put things in Jira the same way, all the people are going to do is just work around it. No one's going to go and work and get their job. They're going to use your system on the side, and then they're going to do whatever they need to do to get their work done to be able to do it. So I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And so I think that though that people are going to, one very amazing thing happening at the moment is, look, I come from this kind of product management world, and we have these like Silicon Valley, and we talk about product operating models. And I'm going to be honest, it's actually the level of depth of thinking in my world is not very high. Yet, if you go to the like team topologies community, the DDD community, the strategy communities that are emerging, the platform communities that are emerging, this is the hard work. Saying like, oh, we should just have empowered teams. You just need to put 6 people in a room and everything's going to be okay. I'm in this world, and none of these companies have solved this at scale either. So the idea, anyway, so I'm trying to give like, if you work in a company that's a massive enterprise, I actually think that many of the innovations that are going to come to organizational design and how to handle things are not going to come from Silicon Valley. They're going to actually come from really thoughtful people in these service ecologies, these large technology-enabled organizations that are taking risks on how to think about sharing this context and things. And so anyway, that's a final observation that the future, I think, is, in theory, could be bright. I don't think it's by simplifying the world, oversimplifying the world. I think it's the people who are grappling with these questions that are going to actually invent the future here. So
Time is up. I know there's a few more questions, but I want us to be on time. John,
Yeah.
this has been wonderful. Anything we can do for you?
Oh no, it's just great. Well, this is a fun morning. Yeah, and I have to go back to my day job. So this is a great way to start the day to do the thing.
Really, really appreciate that you took time to join
Yep.
us. So thank you very
Yep.
much. And
Yeah, thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
And
Good
thanks
day.
for
Okay, talk to you
sharing
soon.
Thank you
your
for
work.
sharing, John.
Yep, thank you so much. Okay,
thank
bye.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Very insightful.
Bye.
Bye bye.